You won't believe what happened to this teacher. Police arrested her right in front of her students, and what happens next will shock you. Don't miss the ending. It's unbelievable. Subscribe and leave a comment. How would you react in this situation? Jennifer Harper had always been known for her dedication and commitment to her students. As a black teacher in a predominantly white school, she had faced her share of subtle racism and discrimination. However, Jennifer never let it affect her work. She cared deeply for her students, especially those who, like her, came from minority backgrounds and faced challenges both inside and outside the classroom. The school, however, was not as inclusive as it pretended to be. Over the years, Jennifer had noticed a growing pattern of unequal treatment towards black students. They were disproportionately punished, often for minor infractions, while their white peers were given second chances. Many of her black students felt marginalized and silenced, and Jennifer couldn't ignore it any longer. In recent months, the school administration had implemented new disciplinary policies, which Jennifer believed unfairly targeted black students. These new rules seemed designed to create a divide, and Jennifer had begun speaking out during staff meetings, demanding more accountability and fairness. Her colleagues mostly remained silent, too afraid to speak up against the administration, but Jennifer couldn't stand by and watch her students suffer. The tension between Jennifer and the administration grew. The principal, Mr. Thompson, was a strict enforcer of these policies, and he saw Jennifer's open defiance as a threat. Behind closed doors, the administration began to discuss ways to silence her. They couldn't afford a scandal, and Jennifer was becoming too vocal. Despite the increasing hostility from her superiors, Jennifer remained undeterred. She had spent years building trust with her students, and they looked up to her as a mentor and advocate. Some of the black students had started confiding in her about their struggles, and she knew she couldn't let them down. They needed someone to stand up for them, and if that meant confronting the administration, Jennifer was ready for it. One day, after yet another heated staff meeting where Jennifer had challenged the discriminatory policies, she overheard a conversation between Mr. Thompson and the vice principal. They were discussing her in harsh tones, calling her a troublemaker, and claiming that her actions were inciting unrest among the students. Jennifer couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could standing up for fairness be seen as causing trouble? It was then that Jennifer realized just how far the administration was willing to go to protect their image. She knew they would stop at nothing to silence her, but she wasn't prepared for what was coming next. A few days later, Jennifer learned that the administration was accusing her of inciting rebellion among the students. She was shocked. They claimed that her advocacy for fairness was provoking the students to act out and question authority. Rumors spread quickly throughout the school, and before long, Jennifer's reputation was being tarnished by lies. The accusation hit Jennifer hard. It wasn't just her career on the line, it was her integrity. She had always fought for what was right, and now she was being painted as the villain. Still, Jennifer knew the truth, and so did her students. She wasn't about to back down now. If the administration wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The day of the big staff meeting arrived. Jennifer had prepared her arguments carefully, ready to face the administration head-on. She knew that this was her chance to make them see the error of their ways. But just as she was getting ready to leave her classroom for the meeting, she received an email from the administration. "Meeting canceled," the subject line read. Jennifer frowned, feeling a sense of unease wash over her. This wasn't like them. Why cancel a meeting at the last minute? She quickly gathered her things and headed to the principal's office to find out what was going on. As she walked down the hallway, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. Whispers filled the air, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. Something wasn't right. When she arrived at the office, she found Mr. Thompson waiting for her, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. The look on his face sent a chill down her spine. "Miss Harper, we need to have a word," Mr. Thompson said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Jennifer's heart raced. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing dread inside her. The principal exchanged a glance with the officers before stepping aside. One of the officers moved toward her, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Miss Harper, you're under arrest." The echo of the officer's words hung in the air, slicing through the usual hum of the school hallway. Jennifer Harper stared at him. Disbelief etched on her face. The word arrest felt surreal, like something out of a bad dream. How could this be happening? She had done nothing wrong. A group of students, returning from lunch, froze when they saw the police standing with their beloved teacher. A few whispered among themselves, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Jennifer's heart pounded as the officers stepped closer. "I don't understand," Jennifer began, raising her hands instinctively in a gesture of surrender. "What are you arresting me for? I've done nothing wrong." But the officers weren't listening. One of them grabbed her arm roughly, yanking it behind her back. The sharp pain of the handcuffs biting into her wrists made her wince, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. The students watched in horror as their teacher, someone they had always seen as a figure of strength and kindness, was treated like a criminal. "Please, stop. She didn't do anything," a student's voice called out, but it was lost in the growing murmur of confusion and shock spreading through the hall. Jennifer tried to catch the eye of Mr. Thompson, the principal, who stood a few steps away, silently watching the arrest unfold. His expression was cold, detached, as if this was nothing more than a routine disciplinary action. Any trace of the man she once respected was gone. "Mr. Thompson, you can't let them do this," Jennifer pleaded, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You know I'm innocent. I didn't incite anything." Mr. Thompson finally spoke, his voice low and calculating. "Miss Harper, you've become a disruption to the order of this school. Your actions have consequences." Consequences? For standing up for her students? Jennifer couldn't believe this was happening. She struggled against the officer's grip as he began to lead her down the hallway, but his hold tightened, and he pushed her forward more forcefully. "Stop resisting," the officer barked, pushing her harder than necessary. Jennifer stumbled, her feet barely keeping up as they forced her down the hall. The noise of her shoes scraping against the tile floor mixed with the soft gasps of students who were now gathering around to witness the spectacle. Tears welled up in the eyes of some of her students, but they didn't dare get too close. They knew that even speaking out could get them in trouble. The fear in their eyes broke Jennifer's heart. She had always taught them to stand up for what was right, but now, watching their role model be humiliated, what message would this send to them? Just as they reached the end of the hall, Jennifer felt a sharp shove from behind. The force was too much. She couldn't regain her balance. She fell to her knees, her body slamming against the cold floor. Pain shot up her legs and into her back, but the officers didn't slow down. One of them grabbed her by the arm and yanked her back to her feet, but not before she felt the sting of the baton hit her ribs. Students gasped. Some shouted, but no one dared step forward to help. Jennifer gasped for air, the wind knocked out of her. Her vision blurred for a moment as she tried to focus on standing upright. "Get up," one of the officers barked, pulling her to her feet with a harsh tug. Jennifer's hands were still cuffed tightly behind her back, and every movement sent sharp pain through her wrists. Her body ached from the sudden fall and the rough handling, but she gritted her teeth, determined not to let them see her break. As they continued down the hallway, Jennifer glanced over her shoulder, searching for familiar faces, any sign of support, anything to remind her she wasn't alone in this. But all she saw were frightened eyes staring back at her. The students were too young, too scared to intervene. She thought of the countless times she had stood in front of these students, teaching them about justice, about equality, about standing up for what was right. And now, in their eyes, she was the victim of everything she had warned them about. She had always known that fighting the system would come with consequences, but she had never imagined it would come to this. As they neared the exit, one of the students, a boy from her homeroom class, broke away from the crowd. He pulled out his phone, shakily lifting it to record what was happening. The officers noticed immediately. "Hey, you!" one of them shouted, pointing a baton at the boy. "Put that phone away." But the boy didn't budge. He was terrified, his hands trembling as he held the phone up, but he didn't stop recording. "She didn't do anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right." The officer took a step towards the boy, but Jennifer quickly interjected. "Leave him alone," she shouted, using what little strength she had left. "He's just a kid." For a brief moment, the officer hesitated, then turned back to Jennifer with a sneer. "You should worry about yourself, Miss Harper," he said coldly. "Let's go." With one final push, the officers forced Jennifer through the front doors of the school. The bright sunlight stung her eyes as they shoved her into the back of a police car. Her body felt numb from the rough treatment, but her mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. As the car sped away from the school, Jennifer stared out of the window, watching the building that had been her second home grow smaller in the distance. The students who had looked up to her for guidance and strength were now left behind, unsure of what to believe, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. Jennifer's thoughts shifted to the boy with the phone. Had he caught everything? Would that video make a difference? She didn't know, but as the police car drove further from the school, a sinking feeling of dread settled in her chest. She was about to face something much worse than she had ever imagined. The police car screeched to a halt in front of the station, and Jennifer Harper felt the cold dread settle deeper into her bones. Her wrists throbbed from the tightness of the handcuffs, and the bruises forming on her ribs from the officer's baton ached with every breath. She had spent the ride staring blankly out of the window, trying to process the reality of what had just happened. But the more she thought about it, the more surreal it seemed. The officers yanked her out of the car as if she were a common criminal. Her feet barely touched the ground before she was pushed forward, stumbling up the steps of the police station. The front entrance loomed large in front of her, the thick doors closing behind her with a deafening thud that felt like the end of freedom. The station's interior was cold and sterile, the kind of place designed to make you feel small and powerless. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, clinical glow over everything. Officers moved about the space, some glancing at Jennifer with indifferent expressions, others with looks of quiet amusement. It was clear she wasn't going to find any allies here. "Get moving," one of the arresting officers growled, shoving her forward. Jennifer stumbled again, trying to keep her balance, her body still sore from the fall in the hallway. They marched her through a maze of corridors, each turn tightening the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She didn't know where they were taking her or what they planned to do, but the thought of being at the mercy of these officers filled her with dread. Jennifer tried to focus on her breathing, tried to stay calm, but the fear gnawing at her insides was impossible to ignore. Finally, they arrived at a small, dimly lit room. It looked like an interrogation room, bare walls, a steel table in the center, and 2 chairs on opposite sides. One of the officers grabbed her roughly by the arm, forcing her into the room before slamming her into one of the chairs. The impact sent a sharp pain shooting up her spine, but Jennifer bit her lip, refusing to cry out. "Wait here," the officer said curtly before walking out, leaving Jennifer alone in the cold, oppressive silence. Minutes passed, minutes that felt like hours. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the handcuffs still biting into her skin. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What would they do next? Would they actually charge her with something? She hadn't done anything wrong. She had only stood up for her students, spoken out against injustice. How had it come to this? The door swung open, interrupting her thoughts. 2 officers entered the room, neither of them familiar. They didn't bother introducing themselves. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sneer on his face, sat down across from her while the other remained standing near the door, arms crossed. "Miss Harper," the man began, his voice dripping with false politeness. "You've gotten yourself into quite a bit of trouble today, haven't you?" Jennifer met his gaze, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling up inside her. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Because from where we're standing, it looks like you've been causing quite a stir at that school of yours. Inciting the students, creating unrest, doesn't sound like the actions of someone who's innocent, does it?" "That's a lie," Jennifer shot back, her frustration rising. "I was standing up for my students. The administration's policies are discriminatory and they know it. This is their way of trying to silence me." The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. "You can tell yourself whatever you want, Miss Harper, but the fact remains. You're here now, and we've got a job to do." Jennifer swallowed hard, the reality of the situation settling in. They weren't interested in the truth. They were here to make her life as difficult as possible. "Here's how this is going to work," the officer continued, his tone growing more menacing. "You're going to answer our questions, and you're going to do it truthfully. If we even suspect that you're holding back, things are going to get a lot worse for you." Jennifer glared at him, her hands still cuffed behind her back, fingers going numb from the lack of circulation. "I've told you the truth," she said, her voice firm. "I didn't do anything wrong. This is a setup." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" He stood up abruptly, knocking the chair back with a loud screech. "Well, let's see how long you stick to that story." Without warning, he reached down and grabbed Jennifer by the front of her shirt, pulling her halfway out of her seat. Her wrist twisted painfully behind her as he yanked her forward, bringing her face inches from his. "Listen carefully, Miss Harper," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not in that cushy school anymore. You're in our territory now, and out here, we don't play nice with troublemakers like you." Jennifer winced as the cuffs dug deeper into her skin, but she held his gaze, refusing to show fear. "You can't intimidate me," she said through gritted teeth. "I know my rights." The officer laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Your rights?" He shoved her back into the chair with a force that knocked the wind out of her. "In here, your rights don't mean shit." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the sound of Jennifer's ragged breathing. Her body ached from the rough treatment, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had faced worse in her life. She could get through this. The second officer, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "You should save yourself some trouble and cooperate, Miss Harper. It'll go easier for you if you do." Jennifer turned to him, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I've done nothing wrong," she repeated, "and I won't confess to something I didn't do." The two officers exchanged a glance, and Jennifer could see the frustration building in their expressions. They weren't getting what they wanted from her, and it was only a matter of time before they escalated. Suddenly, the door burst open, and another officer walked in holding a folder. "We've got something," he said, tossing the folder onto the table in front of the first officer. "Video footage." Jennifer's heart skipped a beat. Was it the video from the student at school? Had it made its way to the station already? She didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. If the video showed the truth, it could save her. But if they twisted it, used it against her. The officer opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He glanced at it, then back at Jennifer, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Looks like we've got all we need." Jennifer's pulse quickened. What did they have? What were they planning to do? "You're not going anywhere for a while, Miss Harper," the officer said, standing up. "But don't worry, we'll make sure you're comfortable in our little home away from home." With that, he motioned for the other officer to pull Jennifer to her feet. They yanked her roughly out of the chair and shoved her toward the door. As they dragged her out of the interrogation room, Jennifer couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. Whatever they had planned for her, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hours had passed since Jennifer Harper was thrown into the cold, dank cell. The steel door clanged shut behind her, leaving her in an oppressive silence. The room was small, with a narrow bench that offered little comfort. The weight of what had just happened still pressed down on her chest, and as much as she tried to stay calm, she couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of helplessness that engulfed her. Her wrists were raw from the tight handcuffs, and her body ached from the rough treatment. She sat on the bench, staring at the concrete walls, trying to make sense of it all. How had things escalated so quickly? How had standing up for her students turned into this? Jennifer's thoughts drifted to her students, the faces of those who had watched her being dragged away. They must be confused, frightened, wondering what had happened to her. She hoped they were okay, that they weren't blaming themselves for any of this. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, the door to her cell suddenly opened. She flinched as an officer entered, but this time he didn't speak. He simply placed a tray of food on the floor and left without a word. Jennifer didn't touch the food. Her stomach churned with anxiety, and she knew she wouldn't be able to eat even if she tried. After what felt like an eternity, the quiet was broken by the sound of a distant commotion. At first, Jennifer thought it was just the normal activity of the police station, but the noise grew louder and more chaotic. She could hear muffled voices, some shouting, and the unmistakable sound of people chanting in unison. Her pulse quickened. Something was happening outside the station. A few minutes later, the door to her cell swung open again, and this time a different officer stood in the doorway. He looked agitated, his face flushed. "Get up," he barked. Jennifer complied, wincing as she stood. Her body was still sore, but she refused to let them see her pain. She walked toward the door, her mind racing with questions. What was going on? The officer grabbed her arm roughly, leading her down the hall toward the front of the station. As they walked, Jennifer caught glimpses of the other officers in the station, their faces tense and focused. The station was buzzing with activity, officers rushing around, phones ringing constantly, and more shouting from outside. They reached the front of the station, and the officer shoved her into a small room off to the side. It was the waiting area, but instead of being filled with people waiting for help, it was filled with chaos. Through the large windows, Jennifer saw the source of the commotion. Outside, a crowd had gathered, and it was growing larger by the minute. People were holding signs, chanting her name, demanding her release. The air was thick with tension, and Jennifer's heart raced as she realized what was happening. The video. One of her students must have posted the video of her arrest online, and now it had gone viral. The footage of the police dragging her through the hallway, the baton striking her ribs, the rough treatment. It had spread like wildfire across social media. And now the world knew what had happened. Jennifer couldn't believe it. She had been sitting in that cell, feeling completely isolated, unaware that outside people were rallying for her. Her heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and fear. This could change everything, but it could also escalate things in ways she hadn't anticipated. The officer who had led her into the room crossed his arms, watching her closely. "Looks like your friends decided to make a scene," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. Jennifer ignored him, her eyes fixed on the crowd outside. She could see the anger in their faces, the determination in their chants. These were people who had seen the injustice and refused to stay silent. And among them were students, parents, even teachers from the school, people who believed in her, who knew the truth. The officer let out a low chuckle. "Don't get your hopes up, Harper. This little protest won't get you out of here. You're not going anywhere." Jennifer didn't respond. She kept her focus on the crowd. More people were joining by the second, their voices growing louder. The police station's front steps were filled with protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for Miss Harper" and "Stop Police Brutality." The longer Jennifer watched, the clearer it became that this was no small protest. This was a movement. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening again. A higher-ranking officer walked in, his face flushed with frustration. He glanced at the officer standing guard, then at Jennifer. "We've got a problem," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone in the room. The officer guarding Jennifer shrugged. "It's just a crowd. We'll handle it." But the higher-ranking officer shook his head. "This isn't just a crowd anymore. It's all over the news. Social media is blowing up with that video. We've got national outlets picking it up. People are starting to demand answers." Jennifer's heart skipped a beat. National outlets? She hadn't expected this to go so far, so fast. "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" the guard asked, clearly annoyed by the turn of events. The senior officer ran a hand through his hair, looking exasperated. "The chief is getting calls from the mayor's office. They want us to release a statement, but there's no way we can let her go now. Not with all this attention." Jennifer's mind raced. Let her go? That meant they were already considering the possibility, but they couldn't because of the attention the case was getting. This was bigger than she thought. The senior officer turned to Jennifer, his eyes narrowing. "You've stirred up quite a mess, haven't you?" Jennifer stared back at him, feeling a renewed sense of strength. For the first time since her arrest, she realized she wasn't completely powerless. The people outside, the video, the attention from the media, it was all working in her favor. They couldn't silence her anymore, not with the world watching. "You did this to yourself," the officer sneered. "We could have kept this quiet, but no, you had to go and make it public." Jennifer lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. "I didn't make it public," she said firmly. "You did, the moment you decided to treat me like a criminal for standing up for what's right." The officer glared at her but didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the guard. "Keep her in here until we figure this out. Don't let her out of your sight." With that, the senior officer stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The guard remained by the door, his expression unreadable as he watched Jennifer. Jennifer turned back to the window, her eyes scanning the crowd outside. She couldn't hear what they were chanting, but the rhythm of their voices was clear, even through the thick glass. They were demanding her release, demanding justice. And it was growing louder, more powerful with every passing minute. Jennifer closed her eyes for a moment, letting the noise wash over her. The fear and uncertainty that had weighed her down in that cold cell began to lift. She wasn't alone. She had people fighting for her, and they weren't going to stop. She took a deep breath, knowing that the fight was far from over. But for the first time since her arrest, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now: hope. The sounds of chanting echoed in Jennifer's mind long after the door to the waiting area had been slammed shut behind her. Back in her cold, cramped cell, she sat against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest, feeling a surge of emotions battling inside her. She could still see the crowd, the protesters demanding justice for her, and she knew that their voices were now too loud to ignore. But she also knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger fight. Hours passed in excruciating silence, punctuated only by the occasional footsteps of officers walking by her cell. Jennifer had no concept of time anymore. The fluorescent lights in the cell block were harsh, making it impossible to know whether it was day or night. All she knew was that she had to be patient. The truth was out there now, and she could only hope it would be enough to turn the tide in her favor. At some point, a young officer came to her cell, unlocking the door with a sharp clang. "Come with me," he said curtly. Jennifer stood, her body aching from the hours of sitting in the uncomfortable position, and followed him down the narrow hallway. She was led back to the same interrogation room where she had been before, the steel table and chairs as cold and unforgiving as they had been earlier. This time, however, when she entered the room, she was not alone. Sitting on one side of the table was a man in a dark suit, a man she immediately recognized, her lawyer, Raymond Turner. Raymond had been her legal counsel for years, helping her navigate the occasional school-related legal issues, but this time he looked far more serious than she had ever seen him. "Jennifer," Raymond said, his voice calm but urgent, "I've been trying to reach you since this whole thing started. Are you okay?" Jennifer nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm fine," she managed to say, though her voice wavered slightly. The truth was, she wasn't fine, not after everything that had happened, but seeing Raymond was a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Raymond motioned for her to sit down, and she did, the metal chair scraping against the floor as she lowered herself into it. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Jennifer, the situation has escalated. The video of your arrest is everywhere. Social media, news outlets, you name it. People are outraged. We have protests outside the station, and calls for your release are growing louder by the hour." Jennifer felt a flicker of relief but remained cautious. That's good, right? It means people are seeing the truth. Yes, but it's complicated, Raymond replied, his expression darkening. The school administration and the police are scrambling to save face. They've already started painting a different picture of what happened, claiming you were inciting violence among the students and creating a hostile environment. They're desperate to justify their actions, and they're throwing every accusation they can at you. Jennifer's stomach twisted. They're lying. I never did any of that. I know that, and the video shows that too, Raymond said, his tone reassuring. But they're not going down without a fight. They've already started pushing their narrative in the media, and some outlets are picking it up. We need to be prepared for this to get ugly. Jennifer's mind reeled. She had expected backlash, but the speed and intensity of the school's efforts to smear her caught her off guard. She knew they were capable of playing dirty, but this felt like a full-on assault on her character and career. Raymond, what can we do? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Raymond leaned forward, his eyes sharp with determination. First, we need to make sure that video stays in the spotlight. It's the strongest piece of evidence we have. The footage clearly shows the excessive force used against you and how they treated you like a criminal without any cause. That alone will shift public opinion in your favor. Jennifer nodded, feeling a surge of determination herself. The video was her lifeline, a piece of irrefutable truth that the administration couldn't twist. What about the students? Some of them saw what happened. They know the truth. Raymond smiled slightly. That's another thing we have going for us. Some of your students are willing to testify on your behalf. They've already come forward to say that you were never inciting any violence, that you were simply standing up for them and their rights. We're going to make sure their voices are heard. Jennifer's chest tightened with emotion. Her students, despite everything that had happened, were still standing by her. The thought of them risking their own reputations and possibly their futures to support her made her feel both proud and humbled. But, Raymond continued, his tone growing more serious, this is going to be a long and difficult process. The school board has already sided with the administration, and the police department is under immense pressure to justify their actions. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves, and that means they'll try to tear you down in the process. Jennifer took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. I'm ready, Raymond. I'm not going to let them get away with this. I won't let them ruin my life or the lives of my students. Raymond nodded, his expression firm. Good. That's the attitude we need. We'll fight this, Jennifer, but we need to be smart about it. The protests outside are helping. They're keeping the pressure on the police and the administration. But we need to keep building momentum. As they spoke, Jennifer couldn't help but think about the countless other people who had been silenced by the system. People whose stories didn't go viral, whose injustices went unnoticed. She knew that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about all the others who had been wronged, but never had the chance to speak out. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation, and an officer stepped in, looking irritated. Time's up, he said gruffly. She needs to get back to her cell. Raymond shot the officer a cold look but didn't argue. He turned back to Jennifer, his expression softening. I'll be back tomorrow morning, and we'll keep working on this. In the meantime, stay strong. The truth is on our side. Jennifer nodded, her resolve hardening. She stood, following the officer back toward her cell, but this time she felt different. The fear and uncertainty that had clouded her mind were starting to lift. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. She had her lawyer, her students, and the crowd of protesters outside who believed in her. As the cell door clanged shut behind her, Jennifer sat down on the bench, her mind focused on the battle ahead. She knew that this was going to be a long, grueling fight, but she was ready. The administration and the police could try to twist the narrative all they wanted, but the truth was out there now. And the truth was powerful. Outside, the sound of the protesters' chants continued to grow louder, their voices echoing through the station. Jennifer closed her eyes, letting the noise fill her with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And she wasn't going to give up until justice was served. Jennifer sat on the hard bench in her cell, her body stiff and tired, but her spirit unbroken. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now, as she waited for the final resolution, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The fight was far from over, but she could feel the tide turning in her favor. Outside, the chants of protesters had become a steady backdrop, a reminder that she was not alone in this battle. The sound of the cell door unlocking jolted her out of her thoughts. It creaked open, and an officer appeared, his face as stern and emotionless as ever. "Time to go," he muttered, motioning for her to follow. Jennifer stood slowly, her body still aching from the rough treatment she had endured during her arrest. She followed the officer down the now familiar hallway, her heart pounding in anticipation. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The hearing, the chance to tell her side of the story and finally confront the lies that had been spread about her. As they walked toward the exit, Jennifer could hear the muffled voices of reporters outside. The media attention surrounding her case had only grown since the video of her arrest had gone viral. News outlets from across the country had picked up the story, and the protests outside the station had swelled in size. It wasn't just her students and their parents anymore. It was people from all walks of life, all demanding justice. The officer led her to a small courtroom adjacent to the police station. The room was dimly lit, with rows of wooden benches and a podium at the front. It was more formal than Jennifer had expected, but then again, nothing about this situation had been what she anticipated. Her lawyer, Raymond, was already there, standing by the defense table, looking composed but focused. "Jennifer," he said quietly as she approached, "this is our chance. Stay calm, speak the truth, and let the evidence work for us." Jennifer nodded, her throat tight with nerves. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it felt immense. She took a seat beside Raymond, glancing around the room. To her surprise, the school administration's legal team was present, sitting at the prosecution table, along with a few high-ranking police officers. They looked grim, their expressions betraying the pressure they were under. The judge entered the room moments later, and the proceedings began. Jennifer's heart raced as the first witness was called to the stand, a representative from the school board. He spoke in a rehearsed, detached manner, trying to paint Jennifer as a troublemaker, someone who had stirred unrest among the students and disrupted the school's operations. She was encouraging defiance, the representative said, his voice steady. Her behavior was not conducive to a healthy learning environment, and we felt it necessary to involve law enforcement to prevent further escalation. Jennifer clenched her fists under the table, anger bubbling up inside her. They were still trying to frame her as the villain, even after everything that had happened. But then Raymond stood. His voice was clear and strong as he began to question the witness. "Is it true," he asked, that Miss Harper had repeatedly raised concerns about the school's treatment of minority students. The representative shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, yes, she did express concerns, but— "And is it also true," Raymond continued, "that Miss Harper's concerns were met with resistance from the administration, and that no meaningful action was taken to address the issues she raised?" The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard. We took her concerns under advisement, but nothing was done," Raymond pressed. "In fact, instead of addressing the very real issues Miss Harper brought to light, the school chose to take disciplinary action against her. Isn't that right?" The representative faltered, and Jennifer could see the cracks beginning to form in their carefully constructed narrative. But the real turning point came when the video was introduced into evidence. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played on the screen. Jennifer being dragged through the school's hallway, the baton striking her ribs, the look of horror on her students' faces as they watched their teacher being treated like a criminal. It was a brutal, undeniable depiction of police brutality. The officers in the video had shown no restraint, no consideration for the fact that Jennifer was a respected educator. The truth of what had happened was plain for everyone to see. When the video ended, the room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. The prosecution had nothing left to say. The weight of the evidence was too great. Raymond stood once again, his voice calm and confident. "What we have just seen is a clear abuse of power. Miss Harper was targeted because she spoke out against injustice. She was arrested not because she committed any crime, but because she dared to challenge a system that has failed to protect its most vulnerable. And now the world has seen the truth." The judge listened intently, and as the closing statements were made, Jennifer could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting. The lies and accusations that had been thrown at her were crumbling, and the truth was rising to the surface. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge delivered his verdict. He cleared his throat, his expression serious but resolute. "Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that Miss Harper was wrongfully arrested, and that the actions of the police officers involved were excessive and unjustified. Miss Harper, you are hereby acquitted of all charges." Jennifer exhaled, the weight on her chest lifting all at once. She had won. The truth had prevailed. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the prosecution, his tone growing even more stern. "Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into the actions of the officers involved in Miss Harper's arrest, as well as an inquiry into the administration's handling of this situation. Justice will not be served until those responsible are held accountable." As the courtroom emptied, Jennifer felt a sense of relief wash over her. The nightmare was finally over. She had fought for herself, for her students, and for the truth, and she had won. Outside, the cheers of the protesters greeted her as she stepped into the sunlight, their voices now a triumphant chorus. They had been with her from the beginning, and now they were celebrating her victory. Raymond walked beside her, a small smile on his face. "You did it, Jennifer. They can't take this from you." Jennifer smiled through the tears that welled up in her eyes. "We did it," she corrected him, "all of us." As she stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the sea of people who had come to support her, Jennifer knew that this victory was about more than just her. It was about all the people who had been silenced, all the voices that had gone unheard for too long. Today was a step toward justice, but the fight was far from over. With renewed strength, Jennifer Harper knew she would continue to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. Because now, more than ever, she understood the power of truth and the courage it took to fight for it. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story moved you, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos. Leave a comment. How would you have reacted in this situation? And don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it.